When airport staff make a heartbreaking mistake with a veteran, it sets off a chain of events that no one saw coming. What would you do if you witnessed someone who served our country being treated this way? Let us know in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to Stand With Our Heroes. Richard Livingston gripped the worn leather handles of his wheelchair, his hands steady despite the faint tremor that had settled in his bones over the years. His army dress jacket, carefully pressed and adorned with rows of medals, caught the light every time he moved. He hadn't worn it in a long time, not since his daughter's wedding, but today felt important. Today was a new chapter, the one who, according to his daughter, already had his stubborn streak. The terminal buzzed with the familiar hum of voices and rolling suitcases, but Richard's focus remained locked on the boarding sign ahead. Gate C-14. That was the finish line. One last push. As he maneuvered through the thinning line, the glances began. Quick, side-eye looks, some curious, some uncomfortable. Richard was used to them. 35 years of service. 8 surgeries, 2 years fighting to reclaim some sense of normal. If a few stares were the price of surviving, he would pay it 1,000 times over. At the counter, the airline employee, a young man with a gleaming name badge that read Tyler, barely lifted his head. "Boarding pass?" Tyler said, voice flat, eyes locked on the computer screen. Richard offered a polite nod and placed the folded boarding pass on the counter. Tyler took it, scanned it, frowned. "You can't board yet," Tyler said, his tone sharp as he handed the pass back like it was something dirty. "Pre-boarding is over. You missed it." Richard shifted in his chair. "I'm a disabled veteran," he said, keeping his voice even. "I'm supposed to board with assistance." Tyler finally looked up, really looked, and something flickered across his face. Not recognition, not sympathy, annoyance. "You should have been here earlier," Tyler said, shrugging. "Rules are rules. You'll have to wait for general boarding now." Behind Richard, a low murmur started as the waiting passengers noticed the exchange. A few eyebrows raised, a few cell phones lifted just a little higher in their owners' hands, the telltale sign of someone starting to film. Richard leaned forward slightly, a slow movement born from decades of discipline. "I was here 15 minutes before pre-boarding started," he said. "Your colleague told me to wait by the seating area." Tyler sighed, dramatically, as if Richard's presence alone was an inconvenience. "Sir, you're delaying the line. Please move aside." A family of 4 shuffled forward awkwardly, the mother whispering to her husband, both stealing glances at Richard like they weren't sure whether to intervene or disappear. Richard's jaw clenched, but he nodded once, stiffly. He rolled himself a few feet to the side near a trash can as the other passengers filed past. Some stared, some looked away. No one spoke. He had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. He had led men through deserts that seared the soles off their boots and jungles so thick they could barely see a foot in front of them. And now, standing, or rather sitting, at the threshold of Gate C-14, he was being treated like an afterthought. A burden. The loudspeaker crackled overhead. "Final boarding call for Flight 872 to Denver. Final call." Richard closed his eyes for half a second, just long enough to gather the pieces of himself that were threatening to crack. He reached into his jacket pocket, fingers brushing against the small, worn photo of his daughter as a little girl. Beside it, the newly printed picture of her baby boy, barely 3 weeks old. They had fought for them, for the future they represented. He would not crumble here. But fate, it seemed, wasn't finished yet. From behind the counter, Tyler leaned toward a woman in a navy blazer, a supervisor judging by the badge, and whispered something. The woman frowned, then nodded. She walked briskly over to Richard, her clipboard tucked tight against her chest like a shield. "Sir," she said, voice clipped, "we've been informed you did not follow proper boarding procedures. You'll need to wait until the final group is called." Richard blinked, incredulous. "I followed every instruction I was given." She didn't answer. Instead, she turned on her heel and strode back behind the counter, leaving him in the middle of the gate, like a statue no one wanted to acknowledge. From the corner of his eye, Richard saw a businessman in a crisp gray suit, approach Tyler at the counter, speaking in low, urgent tones. Tyler shrugged again, indifferent. The businessman's face darkened, but he said nothing more, retreating to his seat. Richard sat there, alone, amid the growing noise of passengers jostling, boarding, laughing, complaining about carry-ons. The world moved on without him, as if he were invisible, a relic of a past nobody wanted to remember. It wasn't anger that rose in Richard's chest. It was something colder, sadder. He looked down at the worn tips of his dress shoes, the ones polished to a dull shine that morning, and wondered, not for the first time, how it had come to this. How a country that once cheered for returning heroes could forget them so easily. Behind him a sharp click of heels echoed across the polished floor. Uniformed TSA officers appeared at the periphery, speaking into radios, but not approaching. Not yet. Richard tightened his grip on the wheelchair's rims. He would not be humiliated. Not today. The clock above gate C-14 ticked in slow, merciless rhythm. The plane outside the windows waited, engines humming softly like a beast just barely held in check. And Richard Livingston, veteran of 3 wars, sat unmoving, waiting for something, anything, to break this moment open. Richard stayed near the wall, breathing slow, controlled. Years of training weren't easy to unlearn, and discipline had been his armor through battles far worse than an airport slight. Still, the knot in his stomach tightened as he watched the final passengers shuffle down the jet bridge. Tyler busied himself behind the counter, tapping lazily at the keyboard, ignoring the murmurs building around them. The businessman who had spoken up earlier was pacing now, fuming silently. A young mother whispered to her teenage son, pointing briefly in Richard's direction before her cheeks colored and she looked away. People noticed. They just didn't act. The gate attendant in the navy blazer reappeared, her eyes flicking toward Richard with a flash of discomfort, but she made no move to correct what had happened. The damage was done. Richard was left behind, a forgotten figure, a closed chapter. The announcement crackled again overhead. Gate C-14 is now closed. All passengers for Flight 872 to Denver should already be on board. Richard swallowed hard, feeling the missed opportunity crash down like a weight across his chest. His daughter's face, bright and proud over the video call just a day ago, floated in his mind. "Can't wait to see you, Dad. Can't wait for you to meet little Tommy. He'd promised he'd be there." He was breaking that promise now. The muscles in his jaw twitched, and he turned his wheelchair slightly, about to roll himself toward the customer service desk to reschedule his flight when the subtle shift in atmosphere caught his attention. A ripple moved through the crowd, like a breeze passing over tall grass. Heads turned. Whispers followed. Richard followed their gaze. Striding through the terminal was a tall figure in full Army service uniform. Deep green jacket, polished brass, combat ribbons, and silver stars glinting under the fluorescent lights. A general. 3 stars on his shoulders. The general moved with crisp authority, but his face was not hard. His expression was focused, determined, and it was aimed directly at the gate where Richard sat. Tyler looked up from his station at the sudden attention, confusion wrinkling his forehead. He straightened his tie, instinctively smoothing his hair. The supervisor at the counter stiffened and dropped her clipboard onto the desk with a loud clack. The general approached without breaking stride, his boots clicking sharply against the tile. He stopped directly in front of Richard, offering a salute that was textbook perfect. Richard, caught off guard, straightened as much as he could and returned it with a slightly trembling hand. "That's right, Major. The general asked Jay." The general asked, his voice carrying easily over the stunned silence of the terminal. Richard cleared his throat. "Yes, sir." The general smiled, small but genuine. "It's an honor, Sergeant Major. I'm Lieutenant General James Reynolds." Tyler's face drained of color, and he fumbled with the intercom. The general didn't look at him. His attention stayed on Richard. "I heard there was an issue with your boarding process," Reynolds said, lowering his voice to a respectful level meant for Richard alone. but everyone nearby could still hear every word. Richard hesitated. Pride battled against exhaustion. He didn't want to make a scene. He had never asked for special treatment, not overseas and not here. "There was a misunderstanding, sir. Nothing that can't be fixed," Richard said finally, voice low. General Reynolds nodded slowly, as if weighing every syllable. "Understood," he said. Then he turned, fixing Tyler with a look so piercing that even the passengers nearby flinched. "Who is the supervisor here?" Reynolds asked, loud enough for everyone in a 20-foot radius to hear. The woman in the navy blazer raised a tentative hand. "Right here, sir." Reynolds walked over to her in 3 measured steps. "I understand a decorated veteran who earned his right to board with assistance was denied that right at this gate." The woman swallowed, darting a glance at Tyler, who suddenly found something fascinating on the floor. "Sir, there must have been a miscommunication." Reynolds cut her off with a sharp gesture, nothing aggressive but commanding, the kind of gesture that years of leading men into war had etched into his very marrow. "Miscommunication is understandable. Disrespect is not." The supervisor paled. Passengers had stopped moving entirely now. Phones were out, held low but recording every word. "You will rectify this immediately," Reynolds said, tone brooking no argument. "You will reopen that gate, reaccommodate Sergeant Major Livingston on the next available flight, preferably this one, and you will do so with the utmost respect." The supervisor stammered, nodded, and grabbed her radio. Orders crackled urgently across the airport's PA system. Reynolds turned back toward Richard, the hard edges of his face softening again. "If you'll allow me, Sergeant Major," Reynolds said, "I'll escort you to your seat personally." Richard blinked, feeling the weight of the moment pressing on his chest, almost more than he could bear. His throat tightened, and it took a moment before he could nod. "I would be honored, sir," Richard said, voice rough with unspent emotion. The boarding bridge hissed as it reconnected to the plane. The door was opened, the flight attendants scrambling into position. Passengers inside the aircraft craned their necks to see what the delay was. A few passengers, already seated, stood up to get a better view. As General Reynolds positioned himself beside Richard's wheelchair, Tyler stepped meekly forward, extending a hand to help push. Reynolds shot him a look that stopped him dead. "I think you've done enough," Reynolds said quietly, not unkindly, but firmly. He pushed her himself, navigating the slight incline of the jet bridge with the care and reverence one might reserve for carrying a flag-draped casket. The businessman, who had spoken up earlier, clapped once, sharply. It echoed off the walls. 1 or 2 more claps followed, scattered, tentative. Then the terminal exploded into applause. It wasn't polite, it wasn't token. It was real. Passengers, staff, even security agents joined in, their hands coming together in a rising roar that chased Richard and the general down the length of the bridge. Richard kept his head up, but his hands trembled on his lap. He felt the tears prick behind his eyes, but he blinked them back. He would not cry today. Not out of anger, not out of pain. Maybe, just maybe, out of something close to hope. When they reached the threshold of the plane, the flight attendant stood there, her hand covering her mouth, eyes wet. "Welcome aboard, Sergeant Major," she whispered. General Reynolds helped guide Richard into the special wheelchair designed to fit the narrow airplane aisles. Flight attendants sprang into motion, helping maneuver him with surprising deftness and care. As Richard was positioned in the front row, another attendant pressed something into his hand. A small flag pin glinting under the overhead lights. "For you, sir," she said. He clutched it tightly, the tiny symbol of everything he had fought for. As Reynolds saluted him one last time, Richard returned it, no longer caring if his hand shook. And, for the first time in a long time, Richard Livingston felt seen. Not as a burden, not as an inconvenience, but as what he had always been. A soldier. A protector. He hit there, my son, Hebuk, who was with us. A father. A man worth respecting. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane finished taxiing to the runway. Richard shifted in his seat, still adjusting to the sudden turn of events. The small flag pin remained clutched between his fingers, its sharp edges grounding him more than the seatbelt across his lap. Around him, a quiet buzz of conversation filled the air, soft and curious. People who moments ago were complete strangers now stole glances his way, some offering smiles, others respectful nods. Flight 822 began its rumbling acceleration down the runway, and soon they were airborne, the city lights falling away beneath them like scattered embers. Richard turned his gaze to the small window beside him, seeing only the darkness of the night sky, but feeling lighter somehow. The general had returned to his own seat farther back in first class after ensuring Richard was settled, but the echo of his actions lingered in the air between them like a protective shield. The flight attendant who had handed him the flag pin returned now, crouching slightly to meet his eye level. "Would you like anything to drink, sir?" she asked warmly, her voice low so as not to disturb the surrounding passengers. "Water would be fine," Richard said with a faint smile. She nodded and hurried off, leaving Richard to his thoughts. It would have been easy to let his mind wander to bitterness, to dwell on the indignity at the gate, the way Tyler had sneered, as if Richard's sacrifice was a nuisance. But the applause, the general's unwavering respect, even the small gestures from the passengers, it reminded him of a truth that was easy to forget in a world moving faster and colder with each passing year. Respect wasn't dead, it just sometimes needed to be called out of hiding. The attendant returned with a bottle of water and a small bag of peanuts. She lingered a moment longer than necessary, as if wanting to say something but holding back. Richard gave her an encouraging nod. "My brother," she said finally, her voice catching. "He served in Afghanistan. You reminded me of him." "Thank you, sir, for everything." Richard's heart squeezed in his chest. He opened his mouth to respond, but words failed him for a moment. Instead, he simply offered a nod, solemn and grateful. As she left, Richard glanced across the aisle where a young boy sat with his mother. The boy, no more than 8 or 9, stared at Richard with wide, awestruck eyes. His mother noticed and gave Richard an apologetic smile, trying to gently shush her son. Richard chuckled quietly and gave the boy a wink. The boy's face lit up like Christmas morning, and he gave a clumsy salute, his tiny fingers trying to mimic what he had seen earlier. Richard returned it crisp and perfect, and the boy beamed. Minutes ticked by. The steady hum of the plane blended with the rhythmic thoughts circling in Richard's head. He thought of his daughter, holding her newborn son, waiting eagerly at the arrival gate. He pictured the moment he would wheel himself into the terminal, see her face light up, and cradle his grandson in his arms for the first time. He could almost smell the faint scent of baby powder and new beginnings. His eyelids grew heavy. He let them close, just for a moment. The peace didn't last long. A voice rose from the middle rows, sharp, impatient. "I don't care who he is. I paid for my seat. I shouldn't have to wait because of some pity party." The words hit Richard like a slap. He opened his eyes, his stomach dropping with the sudden shift in atmosphere. The nearby passengers stiffened. Conversations died mid-sentence. The murmuring hush of shock swept through the cabin like a slow wave. The man who had spoken stood up now, his voice growing louder, angrier. "This whole flight's been delayed because of him, and now I'm supposed to sit here and pretend this is normal? What's next? Are we giving him the pilot's seat too?" A woman's voice, gentle, trying to placate, answered him. "Sir, please sit down. There's no problem here." The man scoffed, adjusting the expensive watch on his wrist. His tailored suit looked freshly pressed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. Everything about him screamed entitlement. Richard didn't move. He stayed rooted in his seat, staring straight ahead, heart thudding dully against his ribs. The man wasn't done. "Maybe if you can't travel like the rest of us, you shouldn't travel at all," he sneered. The words hung in the air, heavy and ugly. The flight attendants exchanged worried looks. One picked up the phone at the service station near the galley, her voice urgent but hushed as she spoke into it. Across the aisle, the little boy who had saluted Richard earlier shrank into his seat, clutching his mother's arm. It would have been so easy for Richard to lash out. to let the years of battle-hardened instincts rise and answer the disrespect in kind. His hands curled into loose fists in his lap. But he didn't move. Disciplined. Dignity. He could fight 1,000 battles, but he would not stoop to this man's level. From the back of the cabin, a voice cut through the tension, cool and commanding. "Sir, that's enough." Heads turned. General Reynolds was standing now, towering over the seats, his uniform jacket sharp even in the dim cabin lights. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't have to be. Authority radiated from him in waves. The irate passenger turned, faltering when he saw who had spoken. But arrogance had a stubborn hold. "Who the hell are you supposed to be?" he said. Reynolds didn't blink. "Lieutenant General James Reynolds, United States Army. And you're going to sit down, keep your mouth shut, and treat Sergeant Major Livingston with the respect he's earned. Or I'll personally ensure you're removed from this flight when we land." The cabin held its breath. The man's face turned an ugly shade of red. For a moment, Richard thought he might push it further, might escalate it beyond angry words. But whatever fire had driven him sputtered out under the weight of a 3-star general's unwavering stare. Muttering under his breath, the man dropped into his seat, yanking his tray table down with a petulant snap. The flight attendant at the galley exhaled audibly into the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain respectful to all passengers and crew during our flight. Thank you for your cooperation." Reynolds sat back down without fanfare, as if it were nothing, as if standing up to bullies was just part of breathing. Richard allowed himself a slow, deep breath, feeling a strange warmth settle over him. Not everyone forgot. Not everyone turned a blind eye. Some still remembered what it meant to stand for something. The boy across the aisle peeked out from behind his mother's arm again, his eyes wide and sparkling with something new. "Oh." The plane flew steady into the night, carrying not just passengers, but something far more important. A reminder. Respect could be lost. It could be threatened, but it could also be reclaimed, one moment at a time. And sometimes it took just one person standing up to light the way for others. Richard closed his eyes again, this time not out of weariness, but out of peace. He would see his daughter. He would hold his grandson, and he would do so with the quiet pride of a man who had lived a life worth honoring, no matter how many tried to forget. The hours stretched long in the cabin, the rhythmic drone of the engines like a lullaby stitched into the air. Most passengers drifted into a weary, fragile sleep, their heads lolled against windows or slumped over tray tables. The overhead lights dimmed to a soft, dusky blue, casting long shadows over the cabin. Somewhere in the back, a child whimpered once in their dreams, and the mother's quiet hush followed like a warm echo. Richard sat awake, his mind refusing the peace that had briefly settled earlier. His fingers rolled the little flag pin back and forth between them, feeling its edges, the small ridges of the embossed stars. It was a tactile memory now, something he could grip when the world slipped too far away. Across the aisle, the boy who had saluted him earlier was finally asleep, his small hand resting against his mother's arm. Richard smiled faintly, the boy's wide-eyed admiration lingering like a soft hand on his shoulder. He wondered what kind of man that boy would become, whether he'd carry respect in his heart for strangers the way he had tonight. Maybe there was still hope for the next generation. A soft voice pulled Richard from his thoughts. "Sir?" The flight attendant, the same one who had given him the flag pin, crouched beside his seat again, her expression different now, not just respectful but urgent. There's a message for you," she said, holding a tablet out toward him. The glow of the screen flickered faintly against her uniform. Richard frowned, confused. "A message?" She nodded. "We received a communication from the ground, relayed through the cockpit. It's addressed to you." Richard hesitated only a moment before reaching out. His hand hovered over the tablet before he took it gently, angling it so the words filled his view. It wasn't just a message. It was an email from the commanding general of the U.S. Army, sent directly through official channels, and marked, "You are agent." Richard stared at it for a beat longer than necessary, the seal of the Army glinting faintly at the top of the message. He read slowly, each word pressing deeper into him. "Sergeant Major Richard Livingston. Word of your situation at the airport has reached us. Please know this: your service, sacrifice, and dignity do not go unnoticed. This nation owes you more than simple words. Upon your arrival, representatives will be there to greet and assist you personally. Welcome home, Sergeant Major. We still stand with you. Respectfully, General Michael A. Bennett, United States Army." Richard let the tablet fall slightly into his lap, stunned. The blood rushed in his ears, drowning out the faint sounds of the cabin for a moment. Someone had seen. Someone had cared enough to act. The flight attendant was still crouched there, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. She must have seen the tears gathering in his. Richard straightened his spine. He handed the tablet back with a nod. "Thank you," he said simply. She smiled, relieved, and placed a gentle hand on his arm before returning to her duties. Richard leaned back in his seat, staring at the dark ceiling above. All his life, he had taught his soldiers that respect wasn't something you demanded, it was something you lived every day, through service, through sacrifice, through simple dignity. And now, after all this time, it had come full circle. He wasn't invisible. Not yet. The remaining hours of the flight blurred together, stitched only by the occasional clink of a cart rolling down the aisle, the soft shuffle of someone heading to the laboratory, the brief, muffled conversation between flight attendants. Finally, the announcement came. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have begun our descent into Denver. Please return to your seats and ensure all carry-on items are securely stowed." A flutter of activity buzzed through the plane. Seatbelts clicked, window shades lifted. The night sky outside gave way to a sprawling field of city lights, winking like 1,000 tiny beacons. Richards adjusted his belt and settled deeper into his seat, bracing for the landing. The wheels touched down with a heavy, satisfying thump, and a ripple of applause moved through the cabin, small, reflexive, but genuine. Richard joined it silently, pressing his palm against his chest where the flag pin sat like a second heartbeat. As the plane taxied to the gate, the same flight attendant returned to him, her face lit with excitement. "Sergeant Major," she whispered, leaning close. There's a reception for you?" Richard blinked. "A reception?" She nodded eagerly, barely containing herself. "We'll see." The doors opened with a hiss, and the passengers were asked to remain seated while the first few rows disembarked. But instead of the usual scrambling and shuffling, there was an odd, reverent stillness. General Reynolds appeared at Richard's side once again, his presence steady, unspoken. "If you're ready, Sergeant Major," he said. Richard nodded. With care and ceremony, 2 uniformed attendants brought the narrow aisle chair, and together with the general they helped Richard down the jet bridge. The cool blast of terminal air hit him first. Then the sight that stopped him cold. There, lined along both sides of the terminal hallway, were rows of soldiers, active duty, veterans, reservists, standing at attention. Their uniforms varied, but the unity in their stance was perfect. At the far end, a color guard waited, American flags held high. And behind them, dozens of civilians, airport staff, travelers, families, stood with hands over hearts, phones lowered, eyes misty. As Richard rolled forward, the first soldier nearest to him raised his hand in a sharp, crisp salute. The others followed, a wave of salutes moving down the corridor like a living tide of honor. Richard's breath caught painfully in his chest. He hadn't felt this kind of welcome even when he returned home from war decades ago. That time, the airports had been cold, indifferent, sometimes even hostile. But now, he was seen. He rolled slowly down the gauntlet of honor, his heart pounding so fiercely he could hear the rush of blood in his ears. Tears stung at the corners of his eyes, but he kept his gaze steady, his shoulders squared. When he reached the end, a young army captain stepped forward, offering a sharp salute. "Hey, welcome home, Sergeant Major Livingston. We're honored to have you." Richard returned the salute with all the strength he could muster. Behind the captain, a young woman pushed through the crowd. Richard's heart stopped. His daughter. Tears streamed openly down her face as she ran the last few feet, kneeling beside his wheelchair and throwing her arms around him. "Dad," she sobbed against his chest. "You made it." Richard wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair, inhaling the familiar scent of home, of family, of everything he had fought for. When she finally pulled back, cradled carefully in her arms, was a tiny bundle swaddled in blue. Richard reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched the baby's soft cheek. The child stirred, eyes blinking open, gazing up at him with a trust so pure it nearly undid him. He choked back a sob. "Welcome to the world, little warrior," he whispered. The terminal around them blurred into a haze of applause and tears, a symphony of honor and homecoming. Richard Livingston sat tall in his wheelchair, surrounded by love, respect, and the unbreakable truth he had lived his life by. He had never been invisible. He had simply been waiting for the world to catch up. The soft sounds of family reunion still lingered in the air, even after the honor guard lowered their hands and the gathering began to disperse. Richard remained where he was, his daughter kneeling beside him, her face still damp from tears. She brushed her fingers over the sleeve of his jacket, tracing the outline of his service stripes as if needing to touch something real, something solid that connected them both to a past and a future. The baby stirred again, wriggling in her arms, a little fist waving up at the world he had yet to understand. Richard leaned forward slightly, his heart aching with a tenderness that no battlefield injury had ever been able to touch. "He's perfect," Richard murmured. His daughter laughed softly, wiping at her cheeks. "He's got your stubborn chin already. Doctor said he fought the nurse every time they tried to swaddle him." Richard chuckled, the sound rusty but genuine. It had been a long time since anything had made him laugh like that. A long time since he had felt joy so pure it slipped past all the defenses he usually kept in place. General Reynolds stood respectfully a few feet away, giving them privacy. But he watched them with a small smile, arms crossed loosely over his chest. A few other soldiers lingered nearby, at ease but attentive, their presence not one of formality but of community. It wasn't just about a uniform anymore. It was about something deeper, something carved into bone and blood, belonging. The crowd of civilians had thinned, though many cast lingering looks over their shoulders as they passed, some whispering quietly to companions. Richard could feel the weight of their gazes, but for once it didn't feel oppressive. It felt earned. His daughter rose to her feet carefully, cradling the baby against her shoulder. "Come on, Dad. Let's get you home." Well, the words sang through him, warm and rich. Home wasn't just a house or a street address. It was a place in the world where you mattered. It was arms to fall into after too many years of standing alone. General Reynolds stepped forward, offering his hand again. Richard gripped it firmly, feeling the strength in the man's grasp, but also the respect. "We've arranged transportation," Reynolds said. "You're not going to have to lift a finger." Richard shook his head slightly, his voice dry. "I still got 1 or 2 fingers left, sir." Reynolds chuckled, a short, barked laugh. "Not tonight, Sergeant Major. Tonight, you let us serve you." Richard didn't argue. Pride could be a heavy thing, but wisdom meant knowing when to accept help. The group moved slowly through the terminal. Airport staff along the way paused to offer salutes or respectful nods. One of the security guards, a young woman with sharp eyes and a crisp uniform, wiped away a tear discreetly as they passed. Outside, the night air was cool, the city lights twinkling against the black sky like promises. A black SUV waited at the curb, doors already open, an army driver standing at attention beside it. Richard's daughter slid into the back seat with the baby, while Richard transferred carefully into the vehicle with the general's assistance. His wheelchair was folded with precise care and stowed into the back without a word of complaint. The driver pulled away from the curb, merging into the slow flow of late-night traffic. Inside the vehicle, the silence was comfortable, broken only by the baby's occasional gurgle. Richard leaned his head against the seat, closing his eyes for a moment. Images from earlier that day flickered through his mind. The cold dismissal at the gate, the indifference on Tyler's face, the helplessness he had felt sitting there while the world moved around him without seeing. And then, the turn, the general's salute, the roar of spontaneous applause, the flag pin pressing against his heart. Life could be cruel, yes, but sometimes it could be breathtakingly beautiful, too. His daughter turned slightly in her seat, her voice soft in the darkness. "You didn't tell me you were coming in full uniform, Dad." Richard smiled without opening his eyes. "Didn't plan to. Just felt right." She was quiet a moment before she said, "It was more than right. It was perfect." The general shifted slightly in the front seat, glancing back at them with a look Richard couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe, or perhaps gratitude. "You reminded a lot of people today why we salute," Reynolds said. Richard opened his eyes, meeting the general's steady gaze. "I didn't do anything special." The general shook his head. "You lived your life with honor. You showed up. That's more special than you realize these days." The SUV rolled through the sleeping city, past shuttered shops and quiet neighborhoods. Eventually they turned into a winding subdivision lined with modest houses, each one glowing faintly with porch lights or window lamps. Richard recognized it immediately, his daughter's new home. She had sent him pictures months ago, but they hadn't done it justice. The wide front porch, the American flag fluttering softly in the breeze, the porch swing. The driver pulled into the driveway and parked. Reynolds was out of the vehicle first, unfolding the wheelchair and setting it up with brisk efficiency. Richard shifted carefully into it, the muscles in his arms straining but holding steady. His daughter came around, her face bright with a smile that could have lit up the darkest corner of the world. "This is your home too now, Dad," she said. "Stay as long as you want." Richard looked up at the house, at the life she had built, and something uncoiled inside him. A knot of loneliness he hadn't even known he was still carrying. He nodded once, firmly. Inside, the house smelled of fresh paint and faint traces of cinnamon. A photo of his daughter and her husband sat on a side table, next to a tiny framed picture of the baby. A toy fire truck sat abandoned near the couch. Richard wheeled himself farther in, feeling the warmth seep into his bones. General Reynolds lingered by the door, reluctant to intrude. Richard turned his chair toward him. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing me." Reynolds straightened, his mouth tightening slightly. "It's we who should thank you, Sergeant Major, for reminding us who we are." With one last nod of mutual respect, the general turned and disappeared into the night, his silhouette swallowed by the dark. Richard sat there for a long moment, drinking in the sight of home, the feel of family all around him. The battles were over. The war was done, and for the first time in a long time, he was not fighting for a place to belong. He was already there. Morning sunlight broke through the windows, casting wide bands of gold across the hardwood floors. The house stirred to life quietly, with the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen and the soft creak of the porch swing moving in the breeze. Richard sat by the window in his wheelchair, a steaming mug resting on the table beside him, watching as the neighborhood slowly woke up. His daughter was upstairs with the baby, their soft voices occasionally floating down the staircase like music. The last 24 hours played in his mind like an old film reel. He thought of the airport staff that had tried to diminish him, the general who had reminded him that respect wasn't something that could be erased by a single act of ignorance, and the countless faces in the terminal who had stood, applauded, and restored a part of him that he hadn't even realized he had lost. He heard the click of the front door opening and turned slightly to see his daughter stepping out onto the porch. She was dressed simply, comfortably, the baby carrier strapped snugly against her chest. She caught his eye through the window and grinned, nodding toward the outdoors. An invitation. Richard took one more sip of coffee, set it down carefully, and maneuvered himself toward the door. The threshold was smooth, the house clearly built with thoughtful design. No obstacles, no unnecessary steps. He rolled himself outside and joined her on the porch. The morning air was crisp and smelled faintly of grass and dew. Birds chirped from a nearby oak tree, and somewhere down the street a lawnmower buzzed faintly to life. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that Richard had spent a lifetime protecting for others. Often wondering if he would ever find it for himself, his daughter sat down on the porch swing and started rocking gently. The baby gurgled happily against her chest, waving his tiny fists, as if conducting a symphony only he could hear. "You're going to spoil me," Richard said, a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "That's the plan," she said, her eyes twinkling. For a long moment neither of them spoke. They simply sat there, soaking in the quiet, the kind that doesn't demand conversation but offers comfort simply by existing. A car turned onto the street, a familiar black SUV. It pulled up in front of the house, and Richard's eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise. General Reynolds stepped out, dressed in civilian clothes now, jeans, boots, a simple button-down shirt. Somehow he looked just as commanding, even without the uniform. Richard's daughter stood up, carefully unstrapping the baby from his carrier. "I'll take Tommy inside," she said with a knowing smile. "Sounds like you've got company." Richard watched her disappear into the house, the door closing softly behind her. Before turning back to the man approaching the porch, Reynolds climbed the steps two at a time and offered a casual salute, which Richard returned with a chuckle. "At ease, General," Richard said. "Ames, today," Reynolds said, pulling a small, battered leather folder from under his arm. "Figured I'd stop by. Brought something for you." Richard tilted his head curiously as Reynolds opened the folder and withdrew a single sheet of paper, thick and formal, embossed with seals at the top. It wasn't until Richard saw the words that he realized what it was. An official commendation, signed by the Secretary of Defense. Richard's throat tightened. His hands, steady through gunfire and chaos, now trembled slightly as he accepted the paper. "It didn't have to do this," Richard said, voice rough. "Maybe not," Reynolds said. "But it needed to be done. You deserve to know your name, your service, your sacrifice. They're not forgotten." Richard read the words slowly, each line hammering deeper into his heart. Recognition, honor, gratitude. He looked up at Reynolds, feeling something bigger than pride or even gratitude. It was a deep, soul-aching sense of being seen, of mattering. "You don't have to fight alone anymore, Richard," Reynolds said. "You never really did. But sometimes the world needs a reminder, and yesterday you gave them one." The breeze stirred the edges of the commendation in Richard's hands. He folded it carefully, reverently, and placed it in his lap. "I spent a lot of years thinking my time had passed," Richard admitted, voice low, "that the world had moved on without men like me." Reynolds shook his head. "The world moves fast, but the values you fought for, they don't disappear. They just wait for men like you to remind us what they mean." Richard nodded, a lump forming in his throat. Behind them, the door creaked open again and his daughter appeared holding the baby. She hesitated at the threshold, sensing the weight of the moment but drawn by it too. Reynolds turned to her and gave a small, respectful nod. "Take good care of him," he said. "Always," she replied firmly, her arms tightening around the tiny bundle. Reynolds turned back to Richard and extended his hand. Richard grasped it firmly, their palms meeting in a grip that spoke of wars fought, battles survived, and a bond forged not by blood, but by shared sacrifice. "You're not invisible, Richard Livingston," Reynolds said. "You're the kind of man history tries to live up to." Richard watched as the general descended the steps and returned to his vehicle. The engine rumbled to life, and with a final wave, Reynolds pulled away down the street. his figure growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared around the corner. Richard sat there for a long time after he was gone, feeling the sunlight warm his skin, feeling the life pulsing through this small corner of the world. His daughter settled beside him again, the baby cooing softly. "You okay, Dad?" she asked. Richard looked at her, at the child in her arms, at the house behind them, at the flag fluttering gently from the porch beam. He smiled. "For the first time in a long while," he said, his voice thick but sure. "I'm better than okay." He reached out and took his grandson's tiny hand in his own. The baby's fingers curled instinctively around his thumb, strong and sure. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, savoring it, locking it away in a part of his heart where it could never be touched by darkness or doubt. He had lived a life of service. He had endured more than most could imagine. And here he sat, not forgotten, not overlooked, but honored. The porch swing creaked gently as they rocked together, grandfather, daughter, and grandson, 3 generations bound by love, respect, and a legacy that would endure long after the battles and medals faded into history. The flag waved above them, steadfast against the endless blue sky, and Richard Livingston smiled into the sunlight, content in the knowledge that he had lived a life that mattered, and that in the quiet corners of the world he had fought to protect, honor would always endure.